Today on Worldview, we take a look at the political compromise and the post-conflict in Zimbabwe.
There are very many people who are lying here who are very great. They sacrificed a lot to bring Zimbabwe to all of us. Today we can walk freely in the streets of Zimbabwe without any harassment. Everybody can associate with anyone, white, black, green, blue. We all mix together. And we owe a lot to these people. So it means it's a symbol to us in the country. Show that there were people who were really prepared even to die.
Zimbabwe entered a state of violent political crisis in the aftermath of the presidential elections held in 2 rounds on March the 29th and June the 27th of 2008. President Robert Mugabe led a campaign of terror against the opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, and its supporters in the lead-up to the electoral process. State-sponsored violence resulted in massive human rights violations, including rape, torture, and forced disappearance. Despite winning the June election, President Mugabe continued to implement brutal attacks against the political opposition.
And the time has come to say enough is enough.
We can't allow them to continue on these violent demonstrations unimpeded. No. Enough is enough.
Responses by the United Nations and the African Union failed to undertake effective measures to address the crisis.
Last week, on the eve of the SADC summit, which was postponed by a week, the proclamation under the Presidential Powers Act. So when some of us sneaked into Maputo to see it all, there's no doubt in our minds, citizens of this region, that there was a crisis. It's important that we, first of all, set the record straight as to what was said, what was the communique. And secondly, more important that we decide as Zimbabweans, as part of this dialogue, to decide on the way forward. How do we move forward? How do we move our country forward, away from crisis?
The biggest mistake, in my view, the central bank made was to communicate that at some point in the future they're going to introduce a controversial bond note. And that killed the people's confidence, because people have been on the same path before. They know what happened to the Zimbabwe dollar. Because of that, people would rather keep their dollars.
The black community would tell you they live better under Smith than under Mugabe. They were brainwashed by a communist propaganda machine into believing that things were going to improve. But sadly, they were taken for a ride.
Civil society groups such as Human Rights Watch and the International Crisis Group swiftly responded and condemned the repression and human rights abuses of the government. Despite the establishment of a unity government through the signing of the global political agreement, the situation remained dangerous and political reforms were not implemented, and Mugabe's party, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, ZANU-PF, continued to engage in political violence. Since 2000, state security forces in Zimbabwe have committed acts of violence against thousands of civilians, targeting primarily political opponents and aid workers. Human rights violations have included imprisonment, enforced disappearance, murder, torture, and rape. In addition, President Robert Mugabe's national policies led to severe economic collapse and grave failure of the national health system. Failed monetary policies, currency devaluations, corruption, and a land seizure policy that devastated Zimbabwe's once thriving agricultural sector led to an economic crush that left 80% of the population unemployed and hyperinflation at approximately 231 million %.
I have no leave legal instrument to allow you people to take the land. I cannot give you that permission.
We are taking it.
But I am not giving you permission. That is up to you.
In particular, the land seizure policy transferred thriving farmland from competent farmers to Mugabe's supporters, simultaneously displacing over 1 million civilians and allowing the farms to fail. This also resulted in a resource crisis, leaving much of the country without welfare, food, or the ability to afford health care. A widespread emigration of medical personnel from the country, failure of sanitation infrastructure, and near universal poverty fueled an increase in mortality and disease.
It is immoral for our leader to travel and spend money going for a checkup, enough money to build a small clinic and stock up that clinic with medicines for a whole month. And so for me, those are the issues, and we continue to say to the citizens, stick to the issues, find a way to express your displeasure at the issues, start a campaign, start a protest, do it, there'll be people standing with you. But
you can't urge people to adopt violence, violent demonstrations as the way of life or the way of solving grievances. No. We will say no. Forever no.
It wasn't easy, but we have to continue fighting. People want change, people want a new beginning, and so we have to continue fighting.
People now are in total fear. There's abject fear about the prospects of being subjected to an election and losing the influence which had given them the aura of statesmanship.
We as the African youth must take responsibility for the transformation of the continent. We are no longer victims. Adwa said, we are not victims, but we are victors. And so we can do this.
Even after Mugabe won the shame June runoff election, routine and arbitrary arrest and detentions and enforced disappearances continued as the ZANU-PF used repression to back its dubious claim to power. Civil society groups immediately and strongly condemned the violence, and some began discussing whether the cries threatened to reach the RTOP threshold. On the 21st of April in 2008, a coalition of 105 representatives from the civil society, including human rights activists, faith groups and students in Africa, wrote a communique which included a discussion of the applicability of the RTOP and call for a concerned and effective response by the international community to guarantee effective aid, delivery and livelihoods to the Zimbabwean people. Activists within Zimbabwe also denounced Mugabe's rule at great personal risk and disseminated information on how pronounced the crisis was.
Government here would not tolerate any criticism of itself. And then secondly, discourage anyone who wants to oppose the government. So it's really just a political trick.
He's in a state of absolute panic. He doesn't know whether he's coming or going. He's like a wounded animal in a corner. You know, that's dangerous and unpredictable.
And in early December of 2008, the Elders, a group of renowned older human rights activists composed of former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, human rights activist and wife of Nelson Mandela, Gracia Machel, and former US President Jimmy Carter, organized a fact-finding mission to Zimbabwe to commission a report that was to be presented to the United Nations Security Council. The group, however, had their visas denied by Zimbabwean authorities, preventing civil society and the international community from investigating or interfering with the mass human rights abuses and systematic repression in the country. Reports from civil society organizations such as Human Rights Watch and the International Crisis Group showed that even 2 years later, the situation in Zimbabwe remained dangerous.
I commended the President for making a call that there should be no violence in the future elections.
The organization condemned the political violence and called for the government to establish the electoral framework necessary for free and fair elections. International Crisis Group echoed the statement in its report, Zimbabwe Political and Security Challenge to the Transition, called on South Africa and other states involved in monitoring the GPA to pressure the parties to abide by the agreement. The regional response to the crisis was minimal and inadequate. Across the continent, heads of states and governments condemned Mugabe's regime and called for him to step down in order to end suffering in Zimbabwe. However, the African Union did not question Mugabe's right to assume Zimbabwe's seat at the AU summit in Egypt from July the 30th to July the 1st of 2008, and Tanzanian President Jakaya Kikwete, who chaired the summit, referred to the elections as historic. The AU condemned the post-election violence, albeit not in a timely way, and deferred the situation to the South African Development Community, SADC. SADC's response to the crisis was widely criticized as civil society groups and leaders within the SADC denounced its lack of reaction and involvement. SADC's strategy consisted of quiet diplomacy, including mediation efforts led by South African President Thabo Mbeki.
We've seen it and we now know, and the government now knows that we now know, that they now know, that we now know. And I think for me, that's the special thing that has taken place. So going forward, everything we are now getting, everything we are now striving for is a result of these victories that we have already gotten. And depending on what happens between now and the elections in 2018, anything that's happening right now between now and 2018 is change. It already is change. The fact that the citizens are prepared now to have a protest almost every day of the week is an amazing feat. And this is where we are going. We say to the citizens that if it means that we keep our government busy with a different protest in a different place every single day, so be it. So be it. So the change has already happened in that citizens are now the game-changing factor in Zimbabwe. And both the ruling party and opposition politicians know that we now are awake. We're ready, yes, to vote, but we're also ready to protect our vote.
This is me, and my people will have me for yet some time, a long time. And those outside who don't like me, I say, well, that's your own concern. I say, I don't mind it. Foreign embassies in the country that are interfering with our politics, intervening although they're doing it privately, clandestinely, I want to warn them to desist from it. We know how to deal with our enemies who have been trying all along to bring about regime change in the country. We have the means to defend and protect our hard-won freedom.
Mr. President, while you are free to tamper with all institutions, the judiciary is sacrosanct. It's the last hope we have for justice. This is why the Constitution, promulgated for the separation of powers between the executive, which you occupy, the legislature, which guides your perimeter, and the judiciary, which serves justice for all. This cookie jar, Mambo, you are not allowed to touch it. We know whose son-in-law is rewarded all the tenders under the executive administration. But now, you're frightening the judges not only to sing your song, but to dance to it too? I mean, what are you teaching us? Perhaps when we are not happy with the judgment, we must also threaten the judges. Or we must go to their houses and terrorize them. The law is the law, Mr. President, and you are not above it. Now, I know the presidency can have you feeling like you're a vice Jesus, especially after occupying it for so long. But you are obliged to observe the law. I have instructed my Secretary General, Agency Gumbo, and our team of lawyers to explore all legal avenues to make you accountable to someone other than your wife. You cannot say what you like in the breach of a constitutional promise. While you're accorded the rights to comment or even be unhappy with the High Court ruling, you appeal to the Supreme Court. You don't get to throw threats, especially you. You who does not like to receive threats. Many are afraid of you, but I'm not one of them. I don't know what you think this is, Mr. President, but being president puts you at the mercy of the people, not the other way around. When our young people enter college, based on a promise you make, to employ them, to empower them, you don't get to have the right to say you were just joking. When parents spend all their earnings to educate their children because you promised an industry ripe for them when they complete, but none is there when they come out, you've got to be accountable. That's kind of how the game works. You make a promise and you honor it. Now, I'm aware that you're protected from civil and criminal suits, but there is a condition there. I can apply to the same judges that you want to make your puppets for leave to sue you, which I am doing. You have lost against our courts before, and I hope the judges have enough courage to protect the fraternity so sacred to so many, so regarded by all. I will beat you in the next election, Mr. President, but I would like to start by beating you in the courts. To my fellow Zimbabweans, when we stand for each other, we stand stronger. When the whites lost their land, we stood and watched because most of us were not directly affected. When Murabachina took place and homes were destroyed that belonged to poor people, the rest of us stood by because we were not directly affected. When Itai Zamara went missing, likewise when police brutality abused our young boys and girls, the rest of us stood by because we were not directly affected. We only win when we realize we are more than they are. Let's give this beast a figure. How many men is it? Is it 1,000 men? Let's be generous. It's 10,000 men. In fact, it's 100,000 men. But there is 14 million of us. We can beat them, but we have to turn to each other, not against each other. I am appealing to the League of Fraternity to help us build this case. Those with the finances, help us build the war chest. And the rest of us, play your part. Register to vote and prosperity will be delivered to Zimbabwe. Because that's what we're all after. A Zimbabwe that is fit for all who live in it. And we can only get that by ensuring we work with each other, not against each other.
One of the questions a lot of people have been asking is, what do we do to make sure that people in the rural areas are aware of the fact that citizens are beginning to rise? Those teachers are part of that infrastructure. They're part of the people that when their students see them and they say, why are you going to do this work? They will tell them that, no, we're doing it because we haven't been paid and that we're not being treated right. We're doing it because certain things are not right in our country. So they are an indicator that the message has penetrated the rural areas. Even though some of the propaganda may be that, well, these protests are only being done by people in urban areas, the government knows that they've been caught. They know it, and people in the rural areas understand. So these are so important because they're helping to permeate every aspect of the Zimbabwean, culture and life and society. Unreachable areas or people groups that were apathetic. Everyone is finding a way to get involved through something that speaks to them. And that's what's important about the rural teachers and anyone else that's starting a movement. We have to have more and more movements come up.
Right now, I think the focus has changed. It is, as we've been hearing all of this morning, what is it that Africa can do for itself? And I think that business of depending either for technical assistance or for know-how or for innovation on the rest of the world is over.
We celebrate and pay homage to the founding fathers of this organization. We need to take note that we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Years ago, when I started working with Ethiopia, there might have been 1 or 2 universities. Today, I would say there must be minimum 30, 40 universities. Every little village or town or state has multiple institutions of higher learning. So we need that kind of an investment in our people, whether it's health, whether it's education.
Human Rights Watch identified the crisis' simple cause: the ruling ZANU-PF leadership's diversion of resources away from basic public health towards sustaining its illegitimate rule, personal enrichment, and oppressing its opponents. Prior to the runoff presidential election in June, the security services and the ZANU-PF militia unleashed a campaign of intimidation, torture, and murder against opposition activists, journalists, polling agents, public servants, civic leaders, and ordinary citizens suspected of voting for the opposition party. The violence came to a climax when, after losing the March 2008 presidential election, President Mugabe carried out widespread state-sponsored violence and terror. Human rights violations, including torture, beatings, mutilations, and rape, were perpetrated against leaders and supporters of the opposition.
The teachers in Zimbabwe are amongst the most uncelebrated heroes that we have in our nation. Please, I did not ask for a round of applause.
99% of Zimbabweans want progress in this country. That is clear. It's our job to assess public opinion. 99% of Zimbabweans want progress, and 99% of people will go along with SADC, as did the leadership in Maputo.
We are the generation that suffered under white colonial rule. We are the generation that went to fight to free this country. We are again the generation that was affected by ESAP. We lost jobs. We were sent home. No rehabilitation, no nothing. Just being sent home with maybe $15,000. How are you going to use it? I don't know. We are a generation now which is being, sponsored by wives and children. Because my wife becomes a cross-border trader. I was retrenched, and then my wife should take over. Our livelihood is coming from the cross-border activities. And when you close that, closing in fact with people coming with their goods without even prior notice, that is disastrous to us. How can we support our own killing? We are being killed. While the motive could be good, but how it is done is what gives us concern.
The United Nations monitored the deterioration of the country, but failed to undertake measures that effectively address the mass human rights violations and violence. On the 16th of April 2008, the President of the European Union issued a declaration on behalf of the EU that expressed its deep concern about reports of violent incidents and the deteriorating human rights situation in the country.
Concern is also rising both inside and outside the country that unless parties agree quickly on some key major reforms and there is a distinct shift in attitude, the next election, which is due sometime in the coming year, could turn into a repeat of the 2008 elections, which resulted in rampant politically motivated human rights abuses, including killings, torture, rapes, beatings, arbitrary detention, displacements, and other violations.
I'm not saying we are free from violations. No country is free from violations.
The people of Zimbabwe remain strong, remain vigilant, and to defend their vote, to defend their democratic rights, and not to give in to any form of intimidation, any form of violence, any form of method that will be used to stop change or to steal the vote.
Furthermore, on the 26th of January 2009, the President extended sanctions on Mugabe and his top aides for their ongoing failure to address the most basic economic and social needs of its people. Since the crisis, the international community has continued to denounce human rights violations. The Friends of Zimbabwe, the group composed of the United Nations, World Bank, African Development Bank, and several countries including the United States, issued a statement on December the 10th of 2010 that expressed its serious concerns relating to the protection of fundamental rights, the rule of law, governance and respect for agreements, Furthermore, the Friends of Zimbabwe called on the government to implement reforms necessary to hold free and fair presidential elections. In September of 2008, President Mugabe and both heads of the MDC factions, Morgan Tsvangirai and Arthur Mutambara, signed the Global Political Agreement, the GPA. South African President Thabo Mbeki became the guarantor of this agreement, which came into effect in February of 2009 and established a unity government in which Mugabe remained as president and Tsvangirai assumed the position of prime minister.
There is no, people should be given time and there should be alternatives. There is no industry that is running. There is no employment anywhere in Zimbabwe being created. 2,000 jobs or 2 million jobs, one job is not found. And people create ways of livelihood. One and the most popular one has been cross-border operations. And these, unfortunately, they have just been cut like, a pipe running with water, then suddenly it's cut. No preparation, no nothing. You don't have water in your home. What do? You go out crying, and this is why people are crying at the borders. They are crying because there was no consultation, no alternative means of living, and it's like we have decided to kill our own people. But people will not die easily. They will resist. They are resisting. And if I was asked, who should I support? I'll support my wife, because she must bring food home.
Civil liberties and the freedom of the media also continue to be subject and discriminatory policies. Although Zimbabwe must continue to work to address poverty, healthcare, development, and civil liberties, these broader grievances are beyond the scope of the RTOP. Political reforms will be necessary to ensure a stable government structure exists with the capacity to prevent further human rights abuses. One can safely say something has shifted in Zimbabwe, perhaps a new uprising to be seen in this 21st century.
Musati tambe nodo zvakwana, musati tambe nodo hatichada, musati tambe nodo zvakwana, musati tambe nodo hatichada, mukati kanda mudenga, mukati budisa mugomba, mukati dzorerazve haiwaga, mukati kanda mudenga, mukati budisa mugomba, mukati dzorerazve haiwaga.